Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the country you're joining us from. We are going to go ahead and get started with the Student Engagement and Attendance Center's webinar, All Hands on Deck, State Strategies to Reduce Chronic Absence. I'm Jarl Crocker. I'm the project director for the SEAC, and we are going to be joined today by three esteemed guests: Hetty Chang, executive director for Attendance Works; Charlene Russell-Tucker, Commissioner for the Connecticut State Department of Education; and Dr. Arsenio Romero, who is Secretary for the New Mexico Public Education Department. Before I turn it over to Hetty to start our webinar, we have a couple of housekeeping items to take care of. First off, if you could go ahead and follow the instructions on your screen, go ahead and change your abbreviation to put your state initials next to your name. That just helps us keep track of who's on the call with us, and it helps you see who your fellow webinar participants are. Also, please feel free to put your role and affiliation in the chat, and also what motivated you to attend this webinar or what questions that you want answered by our panelists today. We also like to remind folks that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available as a recording after its completion. Everyone who comes to the webinar has their microphone off, but we encourage participation. There will be an opportunity for Q&A after we are finished with the presentations. Please use the Q&A function on the Zoom to go ahead and put your questions in as they come up. We'll take them in order. We'll also see if some questions rise to the surface, but otherwise use the Q&A for your questions. And I will also be dropping links to presentation materials in the chat. So please check that as we go through so you can get all of the good information being provided by our speakers. All the resources we'll provide to you, and all of those links will be provided to you along with the recording of this webinar as a follow-up for everyone who has registered. Next, we also like to thank all of the staff who make these webinars possible, starting out with our program officers from the Department of Education, Dr. Tracy Scott, Brian Cohane, and Elizabeth Limbo. I am Jarl Crocker. We're also joined this afternoon or late morning by my co-project director, Sarah Frizzell from the American Institutes for Research. And also just a big thank you to all the staff behind the scenes who make this webinar possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Hetty to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Hetty, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Jarl. Thank you, SEAC. Thank you, Department of Education, for making this webinar possible. It is my pleasure to introduce two amazing Chief State School Officers who we have on this webinar because we think they offer such inspiring examples of what is possible. We are joined by Dr. Arsenio Romero. Dr. Romero is the Secretary of Public Education for New Mexico. He is a native New Mexican. So one of the things you'll see about both of our speakers today is they are so grounded in their states. Dr. Romero is not only a native New Mexican and the son of an educator, but he has had every local role, right? Principal, curriculum, head of a curriculum instruction, superintendent, and now he is using his vision and his leadership and his commitment to his state to lead the State Department of Education. We are also joined by Commissioner Charlene Russell-Tucker, who I have had the privilege of working with for over a decade now, though my hair is much grayer than hers. Some way she will tell me that secret. But what's so amazing about Charlene has been her dedication to this work on attendance and engagement, to data, to family engagement. And one of the things I've seen so benefit the work is the fact that Commissioner Russell-Tucker has held virtually every job in the Connecticut State Department of Education. So she knows so many of the ins and outs of how to get things done, how to both lay a vision and then move the kind of strategy and action that it takes. So between the two of them, the combination of local to state, within and across departments, is just so invaluable in helping to create this all hands on deck approach. And the other thing I know about both of them is their deep commitment to community, to hearing from youth, from families, and to partnering with all the agencies and community organizations that can help make a difference. So with that, let's keep going. Just so you get a quick preview, we're going to talk a lot about and hear from them about making attendance a shared priority. How do you make this sustainable by integrating attention into your existing kinds of strategies? How do you make sure that you're supporting all students, all districts and schools? And how are you revising and aligning attendance policies so that you're doing what works and making sure that you're building in long-term sustainable approaches? Next slide. And I'm going to start just really quickly before we turn to our two speakers to give a quick overview of where we are nationally. So if you go to the next slide, chronic absence, as many of you are all aware, has nearly doubled. And the last federal data, which is for 21-22, shows that it went to almost 15 million kids. And the state data from 22-23 shows only a slight decrease. Next slide. And the challenge that we're seeing is that it's not just the nearly 1 out of 3 kids who are chronically absent. It's the nearly 2 out of 3 students who now are in a school where 20% or more of the schools in their school building are chronically absent. And when chronic absence reaches that high of a level, the impact affects everyone because it makes it harder for teachers to teach, set classroom norms, and kids to learn. And this is a huge increase from prior to the pandemic. Next slide. And part of one of the challenges we know what works is creating a multi-tiered system of support. This is actually a characteristic that both states who are going to be speaking, they'll talk about how they're putting in place. But once schools are reaching these high levels, they struggle to put in place these kinds of multi-tiered systems of supports that begin with prevention. And many of them, when the numbers weren't so high, did not have to put this kind of multi-tiered system in support. So this is new for many schools. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that there are many schools who just hadn't experienced this kind of levels of chronic absence prior to the pandemic, who now are. And in terms of numbers, the largest increase in schools experiencing these much higher levels of chronic absence are the elementary schools, of which there are many more. And so this is fundamentally changing how we have to think about who we have to equip to really take a comprehensive approach to improving attendance. Next slide, please. And we also know that the challenges of high levels of chronic absence are especially exacerbated in our high poverty communities who have been deeply affected by the health and economic and social impacts of the pandemic. Now you can see from this, 69% of the schools with the highest level of poverty have 30% or more of their students chronically absent. Next slide. And what this means for states is they have to both address the fact that chronic absence now is widespread. The vast majority of their schools in their states are facing significant high levels of chronic absence, but it is also deeply concentrated in some of the highest places experiencing the deepest levels of poverty. And that means that how you operate has to also be a tiered support system where you make sure there's support for all schools and districts, whether that's attendance messaging, guidance on good practice. Then you're providing more support for those districts with higher levels of chronic absence, maybe deeper investments in programs like home visiting or really leveraging your intensive high dosage tutoring or your expanded learning or your community schools. And you're equipping them to create teams to address attendance. And then even doing more intensive work in the places where chronic absence is even higher. Next slide. This is really taking a systemic approach to change where we make sure there's actionable data, supported by positive engagement, not punitive action in response to that actionable data, building strategic partnerships, because this is beyond the capacity of just schools to address, ensuring you have adequate and equitable resources, knowing that some places need more, having shared accountability. This is not about blame. This is about how we can work together to take this all hands on deck and build the capacity so we can respond to the actionable data that now exists in states. So next slide. And just, this is something you can do also afterwards, this webinar, but if you're wondering whether chronic absence is a challenge and how much of it's a challenge in your district, this interactive, this web page gets you to both state charts and an interactive map. So that's hopefully more for you to do, because what I want you to really focus on now is the insights and the comments and the vision and the strategies happening in Connecticut and New Mexico. So let's go to the next slide. And just so you guys have a clear about what we're going to do, we're going to start by asking each of our commissioners, our commissioner and our secretary of education, to tell us about their state and why addressing chronic absenteeism matters to them. So we're going to start with Commissioner Russell Tucker. So let's hear about Connecticut.
Thank you so much, Hetty, and certainly my appreciation to SEAC and Attendance Works for the invitation to join today's very important webinar discussion. It's also my pleasure to join my distinct colleague from New Mexico, Superintendent Romero, as well. So about Connecticut, let's go to the next slide. Connecticut is home to over 500,000 students within our public school system, supported by over 100,000 school staff. And as you can see from the slide, we're a diverse education system with close to 54% of our students of color, 44% eligible for free or reduced price meals, close to 18% students with disabilities, and close to 11% English language multilingual learners. And so I share this. So by the way, you see our logo this year. It's Infinite Possibilities is our theme for education in Connecticut. I share this because it is my strong belief that foundational to the success of all of the 512,652 students is being present and engaged in learning every day. As I often say, attendance is a precursor to engagement, which is a precursor to learning. And what we know is that attendance or absent of it is one of the earliest indicators of our students possibly disengaging from learning or eventually going to be disconnected from school altogether. And in high school, we know how important it is for credit accumulation in high school graduation. So bottom line, attendance matters. And this is why Connecticut has tracked chronic absence. As Hetty told you, we've known each other for a while, since 2012, and included it in our school accountability system. And we continue to make sure it is pivotal point of the work that we do. So if you go to the next slide, and by the way, all the data slides that I'm going to share right now are Connecticut specific absence data that's also available on our EdSite data portal. But prior to the pandemic, our chronic absence rate was as low as 9%. We're picking it up here at 10%, but it was as low as 9%, about 50,000 of our students, or, you know, of the 500,000 plus. And this was really a call to action when we recognized that that was happening. We had the whole community working together, including elected officials, to take steps to address it. There comes the pandemic. However, we saw statewide chronic absence rate jump for all students to 12.2% in 2019-2020, 19% in 2020-21, and it continued to grow through 21-22 to 23.7%. And I started out with about 50,000 students, about 117,000 students being chronically absent. So you can see, and you can see from the high needs rates as well, that those rates trended higher. The rapidly increasing levels that we are experiencing meant we needed to really urgently expand all our efforts. The promising news, thanks to the hard work of our districts, our community partners, and our entire education system, is that the rates are declining. And as you can see, from 23.7% in 21-22 to 20% in 22-23, resulting in approximately 18,000 more students regularly attending school. Next slide. It is important to disaggregate the data by student groups as we know, to help determine impact and to determine potential interventions. And the slide you're looking at right now is actually showing month by month data, because we do collect data on a monthly basis here in Connecticut. And you can see month over month, as we're looking at it now and compared to the prior 2 years, that even though there's a lot more work to be done, the gray line is showing you that as we started in October, that those numbers are trending downwards. And so that really is very important. On the next slide, we're also showing information on disaggregating our data by student groups. And that's important as well. When you take a look here, and so we're data informed in Connecticut. I call it we're data obsessed. We really always pay attention to data. Disaggregating by student groups also help us determine the impact and to examine potential interventions. Take a look at this. Take a look at the students experiencing homelessness. At a high at one point over the past couple of years at 60%. You look at high need students and you see those numbers there as well. So while there's a lot of work to do, the good news that's in this slide is that for all our student groups, the numbers are certainly trending down. So it's really important for us that as we go forward, that we continue to do this. I think I have one more slide that I may want to take a look at here, and that is by grade level. And so we've also taken a look to see what's going on at the different grade levels. We've talked about look at disaggregating by student group, also disaggregating the data by grade level. What this is telling us when we compared the previous January to this January 23 to January 24, we see we've made more progress in the earlier grades than the upper grades. And that is telling us something as well that we need to do for more intervention and for more focused attention. So that is where we are for the data in Connecticut, Hetty, and looking forward to hear from my colleague from New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Russell Tucker. I think your presentation and the data-informed nature really gives us clues about what's starting to work, where you're starting to see progress. I want to just call out that it was really impressive that you are starting to see reductions for the highest needs kids. That requires real intentionality. And now we get to turn our attention to New Mexico. I will say we intentionally organized a webinar where we would have 2 states. Connecticut has been at this a long time. When Commissioner Russell Tucker talked about her 9% before that, that was actually an accomplishment because she had decreased it several percentage points for the years before, and then the pandemic hit and you had to kind of think about how to do that all over again, and in this new context. But New Mexico is much newer to this work, and we think it's important for people to both hear from someone who's more of an experienced old hand on this, as well as what does it mean to take this work on now in this new environment and launch it with a vision for what's possible. And so with that, Dr. Romero, please tell us about New Mexico and what are you seeing about your data?
Hetty, thank you for having me here today, Commissioner. It's so great to see you again. And I think this was a really good intentional way to be able to share 2 states. And so just a little bit more about that. We've got one on the East Coast. We've got one in the southeast part of the country. When you think about New Mexico, it's a very unique state, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But just thank you for having me here to speak about the attendance initiatives throughout the state of New Mexico and what we're implementing. You know, when you think about this is an issue that we can all relate to. This is a root cause issue that we have no matter where you're at across the country. A missed school day is a lost opportunity to learn. And attendance is vital to school performance and academic outcomes. And that's why we here at the New Mexico Public Education Department are investing in addressing chronic absenteeism. New Mexico, like the rest of the nation, it continues to struggle with chronic absenteeism in the years following the pandemic. Kind of to put a picture on where we're at right now, absenteeism prior to the pandemic was right around 18% of our students were considered chronically absent, which is at that time too many. But now, last year, we're coming into this as we're starting to get some time outside the pandemic. 40% of our students are considered chronically absent. That's meaning that 10% or more have missed school. In the simplest terms, that's 2 days a month. 15% of our students that we refer to as extensively absent because they have missed more than 20% of their time in schools. So to just put a little bit of this in context, and Hetty, you talked a little bit about the different positions that I've been in New Mexico, and this is my 28th year in education. I've been a teacher, I've been a principal, I've been a superintendent, and now I've been in this position as Secretary of Education for the Public Education Department in New Mexico for a little over a year now. And as we were looking at the data, as we are gathering more and more data as to the outcomes and the effects of COVID, this is a place where we want to spend an enormous amount of our time, energy, and resources. There's lots of things happening across our country and in our school districts. And just to speak about some of those things in New Mexico, we've invested greatly in structured literacy. We've invested greatly in career technical education, innovation zones. We're really starting to just dive into the power of artificial intelligence and how that can support our schools. But no matter what I talk about right now, from early childhood education to the innovation that we have in K-12 education, to the opportunities we have for students that graduate to be able to go into the workforce or go to school at a 2 or 4 year institution in New Mexico, essentially for free through our opportunity scholarships, none of that has the kind of positive outcomes that we need because they need to be in school every single day. We need to be able to solve the issue of chronic absenteeism. And so nothing else is going to have the full impact until we can resolve this issue. The reason for students not attending schools, they vary. When you think about New Mexico, it's a big area state-wise. We've got along the southern part of the state, our border region, where we have direct partnerships with Mexico and with our border areas. If we get to the northern part of New Mexico, we have 22 tribes, pueblos, and nations that all have different needs. And of course, we have along the middle of the Rio Grande Valley, we've got Santa Fe, we've got Albuquerque, we've got Las Cruces, which are our urban centers in the state. And so because of that, we've had to think very uniquely about how we're approaching this issue, because in every community, every family, it's a little bit of a different issue. As you can see from our demographics, we serve over 305,000 students with a large percentage requiring specialized services. We've got special education, including gifted, English language learners. New Mexico is also unique in the fact that we serve a population models bilingual and multicultural education programs across the state. Which includes Spanish, native languages, and of course, American Sign Language. In 2019, New Mexico was one of the first states to address chronic absenteeism through legislation, through the passage of what that we know of as the Attendance for Success Act. This piece of legislation, it really shifted the focus away from truancy and towards a preventative and supportive approach to getting our kids back in school. We shifted away from the idea of blaming students and families, and instead are focusing on determining what barriers are in place. What do they face, and what do schools and school districts, what can we do to help break down those barriers?
Dr. Romero, I'm going to make a quick suggestion because we had a few slides here that were just about your demographics, but we then had a slide that was actually about what you're doing in New Mexico. I'm going to suggest we're going to keep going and actually shift over and have you go from your discussion of New Mexico to the slide on what you're doing. And then Commissioner Retheltater, we're going to come back and have you talk about what Connecticut is doing. So if you can, the person who's shift over to slide 35, let's just, So you were mentioning that you've got your Attendance for Success. So why don't you go ahead and talk about some of the key things that are happening in New Mexico as you launch this work?
Absolutely, love to. Thank you for that. Yeah, so the Attendance for Success Act, this was legislation that was passed. And what this really requires is that each school district, local school entity create an attendance improvement plan. That really identifies the challenges and barriers that families are facing and the strategy to help prevent chronic absenteeism. This is a strong partnership between local LEAs, schools, and the public education department. Now, what we're finding is that the problems are very complex. There's not one, there's not five, there are dozens of reasons why this happens depending on where you're at in the state. And so sometimes the solutions can be as simple as making sure that your students feel welcome. It's building those relationships with students, making sure that somebody's checking in with them every single day. When they do miss, it's us checking in with them and having that relationship about why they missed and what kind of consequences that is. But also to have access to what they need to catch up, and through really having those abilities through technology and having that pre-planning in place and that plan in place to be able to meet the needs of those individual families. We've also found many issues around transportation, that if the students taking the bus and they miss the bus, that's it, they're not coming. And so when we have so much of the state in a very rural type of environment, where we've got farm, agriculture, many things around ranches and cattle, we're talking about some students can be an hour away from their local school district. So we're trying to think about ways in which we can either have multiple ways for them to be able to get to school, or multiple ways for us to be able to continue that positive relationship, even if they are at home. So,
and Dr. Mayer, it seems like that's partly why your emphasis was on each school having their own school improvement plan,
absolutely,
so that they could take into account their local assets and their local challenges.
That's it, exactly. So those local attendance plans are very unique to their environment. So whether you're in our largest city like Albuquerque, or whether you're in a very small community, it's very much built around your needs. And it's the partnership we have between the public education department and those local LEAs to be able to make those things, one, plan them, but also execute them. And so you see here in this slide, again, some of the work that we're doing. It was House Bill 236 around the Attendance for Student Success Act. And so we are now in year 2 of that legislation, and we're starting to learn about how we can now continue to even improve that. Families right now do have access to a public-facing dashboard to be able to have access to data in their, not only statewide data, but data within their community about what that means and what that chronic absenteeism issue has an effect on their community. We also have a statewide conference in place, and this is where we have a wonderful partnership with United Way, and of course, districts like Albuquerque Public Schools, which is our largest school district. And what this does is this offers a statewide conference twice a year to build knowledge and understanding of the best practices that we have around chronic absenteeism and attendance. And Hetty, that's where I got to see you last, and we had a great time there. It was well attended, and we had some great conversations with attendance counselors from across the state of New Mexico. We've also done some things around working with some of our partnerships around the country and around the state, specifically around Graduation Alliance and through entities like Engage New Mexico. These are projects to support districts in reaching out to families to specifically identify those barriers in attendance, and we can work one-on-one with families that help inform what those attendance plans are going to be like. So since 2020, over 72,000 students have been referred to for this program, which we're really excited about. Some other areas that we're really working on is how we're using additional legislative funding. We had over $5 million that was appropriated from a legislature last year. Half of that went directly to school districts that they applied for to be able to help implement their specific attendance plans. And of course, we're using our communication teams to really develop a statewide plan so we can get to every corner of the state and every family in the state about what chronic absenteeism is and what happens when you do miss school and what kind of consequences that has, and making sure that we can have that relationship with parents. So this awareness campaign has come to be known as Showing Up Together. This campaign kicked off in the fall of 2023, where Albuquerque Mayor really introduced a proclamation for Attendance Awareness Month, and it's soon going to be expanded throughout the state to continue bringing awareness to the importance of school attendance in New Mexico. And with that, Hetty, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I want to ask one question, and then we're going to shift over to Dr. Russell Tucker. But you, as part of your work, is, if I remember, also in New Mexico, they banned taking a punitive, using courts. Right. Can you just say a little bit about that as a part of this work too?
Absolutely. So we really had some really great conversations with local LEAs, school superintendents, board members about that right there. Sometimes we were causing some of the problem, especially when it came to to suspensions and expulsions. We wanted to make sure that we kept those students engaged in the classroom, and we're really moving away from those punitive types of discipline measures so that we can support those families and making sure that they are connected to schools and stay in school. But also for those students that do drop out, that do, for many reasons, leave us for a certain amount of time, to have very intentional plans about them re-engaging with the school and making sure that we can build those relationships with them and get them back on track to whether they're in elementary, middle school, or high school on the road to graduation. We've also realized that we have to build relationships not only with the school system and the families, but with the local businesses, through internships, through job-related opportunities, through athletics and activities. These are all things that keep kids in school, and we know that. If we can have students have those types of relationships with their local communities, they're almost guaranteed to graduate.
All right. So appreciate the vision that you've laid forward, both taking locally tailored plans, really moving on positive engagement and support versus a punitive approach, and finding ways to leverage all these resources that you're making available. I would like to now shift back to Commissioner Russell Tucker and have her take us through, so if we can go back to the Connecticut slides, what are the key strategies that are underway in Connecticut to address chronic absenteeism?
So thank you again, Hetty, for this. And Secretary Romero, we're not too far apart with some of the things that we're really talking about and doing. So that's really great. So on the next slide, you'll see information that we have to better understand the attitudes and perceptions, thank you, that's the slide, around attendance in school, and to uncover key factors contributing to lower chronic absence across Connecticut. We conducted a survey of adults with children in grades K through 12. Over 5,500 families responded. The survey was in English and in Spanish on reasons. And so the major themes across why respondents has been keeping their children home included family obligations, emergencies, mental health and anxiety and stress, chronic illness like asthma, COVID, as we know, and other viral infections, and the need for connection with school staff who speak their same language. This feedback certainly helped to shape our attendance awareness that we do, along with other just systems and supports and policy decisions. So on the next slide, you'll see some information here on a holistic and multi-tiered approach. Hetty, you talked about that earlier in terms of the work that we do. And so you're looking at what we're saying we can do at the state level, right? What kind of supports from the state education agency and the state agencies writ large for this work. And so we've taken a systemic, multi-tiered approach to chronic absence. We're building on communities of practice, clear policies, shining a light on best practices. Don't ever underestimate the power of leveraging bright spots. You'll see that on the screen as well. And we also have a state attendance advisory team with external partners from districts and community agencies that meet monthly. They're able to tell us really what's going on the ground and to let us know what's happening, so that this work, as you've heard, cannot be done in silo. In the next slide, and folks, I don't know if we're sending these slides out, but there's a lot of information out on there that you can take a look at. But because of time, I'll just move on to the next slide. Some additional key strategies. Chronic absence webpage, we've talked about, Secretary Romero talked about data, making it publicly available, make sure that everyone will have the opportunity to know what the data are saying, and so they can get that information that's there. But I want to amplify this Talk Tuesday, which is a virtual information sharing session that we've been doing now for some time, that provide districts and school staff an opportunity to get together to really talk about issues and to address what's happening. And we've been doing that with a lot of great attendance. Attendance Works help us with peer learning networks that we do as well, embedded coaching, and all the work that we're doing. The campaign is School is Better with You campaign that we're doing. And I'll go right into this other program that we're doing, which is LEAP, but also to say we use the data to really determine what of the work that we need to do. So we did a research brief on high school bright spots for reducing chronic absence. We've recently done a high school affinity group where participants share and learn together and improving high school attendance. And we've just kicked off one with kindergarten attendance affinity group. So we're using the data to inform us. But the next slide that I want to pull up is really to talk about our learner engagement and attendance program that was launched in 2021 by our governor with the Department of Education, underway in 14 high needs districts, with more to come. And I don't know if we have any of our districts on this webinar with us, but we're so appreciative of all their work. So what is LEAP? It's a research-based relational home visiting model, proven to increase student attendance and family engagement. Home visitors, they knock on doors, they're doing home visits to re-engage our students and to really, not only that though, but find out what are those barriers, what are those resources, what is it that they need? And it is really supporting and creating trust in relationships with families through this relationship partnership with families. Home visitors are connectors for families of services. It's where is the shelter that I can go to? It's about transportation, all the kinds of things, Secretary Romero, that you talked about that are barriers. We have boots on the ground making those connections. So what? The next slide just really shows what we have learned from this research, a research that was done by our research collaborative that we put in place for COVID. That's helping us making sure that we know the impact of our ESSER investments. And so they evaluated the LEAP program, and what you see on the screen really is the impact. A month after the visit, a 4 percentage point increase in attendance. 6 months, you see a 10 percentage points for pre-K through grade 5, and 20 percentage point increase 6 months after the initial visit for students in grades 6 through 12. And you can see on the slide as well that in-person visits were much more impactful. So wanted to just share that with you. There's a lot more happening in Connecticut, but that is one that we're really very proud of, the impacts that's there, and others are really trying to learn from this, the LEAP program as well. So Hetty, why don't I pause there and turn it back to you as well?
Well, thank you. And I think what it shows, Charlene, what you're doing in Connecticut, which has been building over time, is how you've really created, you can just leave it on the slides where they are right now, a comprehensive approach, and your LEAP efforts build upon that approach by helping you to deepen and expand engagement where the data shows, you know, just the regular tier 1 isn't sufficient. It's so impressive about how you all have been able to do this. I want to just check. I actually would love to shift to asking both of you about where you see, and maybe what we can do is take off the slides for a moment, shift. Unless, Dr. Romero, there's something that you really wanted to speak to the New Mexico slide now that you've heard. But I'm actually wondering if we can just have the three of us highlighted and engage in a little bit more of a dialogue. And we can also create spaces for people. I want to be able to go to some of the questions in the chat and also have a chance for us to talk to each other. Both of you actually have home visiting. I think, Dr. Romero, you also have the Graduation Alliance. That's kind of a home visiting approach, yeah?
Correct. That's absolutely right.
There's a question in the chat, which is, what are some of your guidance? How do you when you're having people do home visits? I think there's home visits and there are home visits. Some can be even punitive in nature versus relationship building. So let me start first with Charlene, because you just talked about LEAP. What's the guidelines? How do you ensure that that's an effective home visit? And then I also want to ask the same question to Dr. Romero about how they're doing that in New Mexico.
So another great question, Hetty, and we have a hub that is supporting our home visitors. So it's not a kind of arbitrary, go do what it is that you need to do. But we do have folks who are helping to make sure that there are guidelines and guidance about what you do and how do you make the connection. Like you don't go alone and, Are you meeting at a family's home, or are you meeting them out in the community, in the neighborhood? And so there is a mechanism for all these home visitors to continue to kind of learn from each other, but also be supported in the work that they're doing, so that there's some consistency about what is happening within these home visits. And that is really very important.
And as part of that, is there guidance about what should be discussed? So the question in the chat was, or in the Q&A was, is it focused on forming relationships or something else?
Absolutely about forming relationships. Relationship matters, right? And so that is the concept, is how are you, right? It's really about that piece that I see the benefits from this visit. Yes, we're getting students back in school, but it is about, it's not, we're knocking on your door because, you've done something wrong, but it is about how do we support you to understand, number one, the relationship. What is it that you need? And if you do that, folks are more likely to share with you what the challenges are and what the helps and supports that they need. So it's relationships first.
And if I remember correctly, you're not even necessarily saying, hey, I'm here to visit you because you've had such poor attendance. You're really just saying, hey, I want to make sure that you're connected to all these resources and you're succeeding.
That's right.
Dr. Romero, how does this work how does the home visit aspect of the work play out in New Mexico?
So, very similar. And, I think first we went through the protocols of what do we want to do? What is the purpose of going on a home visit? Who should be there? And so very much, I want to reiterate what the commissioner was saying, is that we want to build relationships with families. When we see families across New Mexico, every one of them has a separate issue as to why they may have a chronic absentee issue happening within that family. So our first steps is to build relationships, start to build that trust with them, and really trying to find out what those unique issues are so that we can maybe solve those issues, which would allow the kids to be able to be in school every single day. But we've also found out that there's other really unique ways to be able to make the connections with students. So absolutely, our go-to is being able to visit them in their community, in their setting, whether that be home, at their home, or within their community somewhere. But we've also looked at using social media. We can really find out a lot about that student and what they're going through by having the connections with social media, but also having that direct contact with them. And of course, everybody has their cell phones, right? And so that's another tool that we found to be very effective through texting and having that kind of relationship also. When we roll all those things into play, we really start to get a good picture of what those families' needs are and how we can individually support them and their family as we move forward.
So then I want to ask another question on this. So it feels overwhelming sometimes to say we're going to do it kid by kid by kid. Are there ways, and I believe you both have ways, for taking the data and looking for bigger patterns so that you can see whether there's need for more programmatic, systemic, or policy solutions?
No, I would say absolutely, and that's so you're collecting data and you're using that not just for the sake of collecting data, but because you have the information to inform next steps, prevention and intervention, right? So you're able to determine, is there something in the community then, right? If you're hearing the same or finding out the same things from families, what is it about that you can do in terms of the community itself? And it helps us at the state agency level, right? When I see the data or you see things, for example, students experiencing homelessness, it says to me, I've got to work with my Department of Housing. I've got to work with, the larger systems to try to pave the way to support families and to support whole communities. And so this is not a silo sport by any stretch of the imagination, but you use the data to inform kind of those macro level shifts that you need to be making.
And if I'm remembering correctly, what you have with LEAP is you actually have, every time a home visitor goes and does a visit, they're doing a needs assessment, putting all that information into a data system that then allows you to see. I'm remembering, like, in one of your communities, the challenge was there wasn't Spanish information in Spanish for families to get access to resources. So you can see those programmatic efforts. And I think, Dr. Romero, you have a similar approach with Grad Alliance?
Absolutely. So we use them in a number of ways to be able to be very specific about that. But yes, as we collect data, we want to be able to kind of put those in buckets with some of the common issues that we have. So I mentioned earlier, like transportation. That's been one of our root areas that we want to really get into the weeds on is making sure, why are so many students having issues with transportation? How can we adjust that? How can we set up second bus routes just to get kids to school? And so as we do that kind of work, we're learning more and more about how we can individually meet the needs of those students across New Mexico. I think about the other partnerships that we have and how so all of this not only informs how we can support chronic absenteeism, but it also allows us and where we can actually fund other supports across the state that will have a positive impact on a chronic absenteeism. So we're braiding ideas and funds together. So we know that if students have a reason for being in school, they've got a good relationship with teachers, with counselors, with principals and school leaders, that's a positive. If we have reasons for students to be able to be connected to CTE programs or athletics or activities, those are reasons people want to be in school also. So these are all larger conversations that we have as we are collecting data about why students are having chronic absentee issues, allows us to inform all the other things and the other programs that we have to better support students across New Mexico.
So it sounds it's both about expanding opportunities for engagement while also addressing barriers like transportation or like maybe health that could prevent kids from being there. I want to ask then another question. Some of the work is really requiring interagency collaboration.
Yes.
And you all, as commissioners or secretary, are uniquely positioned to try to make sure that this is not seen as a schools alone, but something as a community with public agencies. How is it that you make sure those strategic partnerships are in place?
So I can start with, it starts at the highest level of leadership in our state, and it starts with our governor, whose construct for his state commissioners, you work together, right? We can't solve issues in silos. And so just going, LEAP program was initially funded by the governor's education funding, like $10 million, right? That received for pandemic relief. And so that was such a great concept to have our governor, right, basically saying attendance is something we need to pay attention to and continue to fund it and be very much engaged. We've done visits together. And so taking the data again, Hetty, then I'm able to talk to public health, right? When we see health issues, when we go right to a public health agency to set up systems that can be helpful locally. The same is true, as I said, for housing or for social services or for early childhood. When we learn that early childhood, childcare is an issue, how do we work together? And so it's really important. And for any state agencies on the webinar today, that is really important. When I said this is not siloed, I mean that what is the power? We can lead to convening. When we invite folks to meeting, Secretary, people usually come. And so there's so much that we can do at this level, and not to take the policymakers out of it as well. And so what is that work with policymakers? And we're able to do that from the seat in which we're leading this work.
I love it. And I think, just along those same lines, our governor had a very strong vision about how this should move forward and how we really need to work together within our different agencies in New Mexico to be able to tackle this problem. So absolutely, we have strong partnerships with our Children, Youth, and Families Division, with our public health agencies. We all work together to be able to solve this issue. But I also want to talk about, we're very intentional around what we do from birth to career, cradle to career, and that's been something that our governor has been very adamant about, that we have a very intentional way in which we're working together through agencies to be able to do this. So a lot of this work is now being done with our early childhood agency, where we are giving students access like they've never had before to early literacy, to supports, not only to the children, but to the families. And so every student in New Mexico now has the opportunity to have access to early childhood literacy. And we see this as going to be very impactful as students now move into K-12 education. Then I want to take us to the other end. We've also been very intentional about what we're doing on the higher ed side of things. What happens when students get to graduation and what do they do afterwards? So having those very intentional programs to make sure that they have access to job-related activities, to internships and access to those types of partnerships, or also to 2- and 4-year college programs. So we're very much taking the approach of what happens from cradle to career and making sure that we have students having the opportunity to have access to early literacy and experiences so that they're more successful in elementary school, kindergarten, into middle school, high schools. We start to really develop those opportunities through job-embedded opportunities, through internships and dual credit opportunities. So they have a plan of what's going to happen after they graduate from high school. And so we've also gone all in around structured literacy and making sure that students have those types of opportunities from preschool into elementary school and now middle school. So the reason this is important, as we're talking about chronic absenteeism, there's always a reason for these things. And so it's really making sure that you have that root cause analysis conversation so you can back up and really make sure that you're having a positive effect from the moment you have access to those students. And we're seeing that kind of positive impact really playing out now. So even though we are early in the stages into the work we're doing, we're already seeing some really positive outcomes because of this work and the very intentional systems that we've built around this between early childhood, K-12 education, and higher education.
I'll jump in, and I know, Hedy, you probably want another question, but that is so important, what the secretary just said, because that level of intentionality, too many times when we initially talk about chronic absence, we look at what's happening with the family, the community, and which we have to do. So that's really, it's a both and, but we also have to think about what happens inside the schoolhouse doors. So when I get students there, how are they engaged? And so making learning relevant is what Secretary was just talking about. And dual opportunities, it's working to create opportunities for all students to explore multiple career pathways, right? It's working with employers, it's the apprenticeships, it's all of that work that is making learning relevant. And it's also, you talked about literacy. Imagine if you're not, reading if you're not a proficient reader by, say, 3rd grade, and you start falling behind, think about not having school success and how that impacts wanting to get up every day and be in school. Or if we're looking at exclusionary discipline. So all of these come into play as we think about this work. So it can't be isolated or bifurcated. It is looking at the entire structure when we talk about improving attendance.
Absolutely.
So that is so helpful. I think it's two sides of the same coin. You got to get kids engaged, families engaged, and make sure they know what's happening in schools. And you have to understand what are the barriers outside of school, because when kids can't show up, it's hard to keep them engaged. There's a question about the difference between looking at chronic absence and excused absences and unexcused absences. How do you think about that? Do you approach it looking at excused and unexcused differently? Do you see it similarly? How do you think about those two issues, or ways in which we define absenteeism and how they're connected or different?
So being in attendance has a definition in our state and has long been in our state for being present in school for half of the day. And that didn't change during the pandemic, so we have a definition. And because attendance has been a part of, chronic absence has been a part of our accountability system since 2012, I call it a mature indicator. We've done a lot of work on definitions and the work that needs to happen there. But for us, you can talk about excuse, but we're talking about missing learning time, right? And so even though, yes, there's excused absences, we're still wanting to make sure that our students are present as much as possible.
Is this response different if a student has absence that is excused versus unexcused in Connecticut?
You still need to know what's happening, right? It's still very important that for excused, do you need some intervention? Do you need some supports? What is it that you need? And so I look at it, you're not here, let's find out why, to try to figure out how to support you.
And I would point out that in Connecticut, like New Mexico, you also don't you don't use the courts to address unexcused absences. So in that sense, it's still about finding out why kids aren't there, helping families understand why kids need to be there, and then figuring out those barriers. So it seems like what you're saying in this case, you're not really making a differentiation between. In either case, you have to kind of take a supportive approach.
That's correct.
Dr. Romero?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a wonderful part of the conversation because we need students to be able to be in school so that they can have access to all the wonderful things that we've been talking about. But many times there are reasons why students aren't in school. So you talked about unexcused and excused absences. Really, we have gone to the approach that we need them there, but we're trying to also be responsive to families across New Mexico. So for some of the examples, we have been able to work directly with some of our tribes, nations, and pueblos so that we can build school calendars around their things that are important within those communities. We've also tried to build relationships so that we can make the connection about what's happening in schools and what's happening in communities so that we can, they're still learning opportunities. We want to be able to be responsive to that. This is a state in which we have much tradition. We kind of can see when things happen across the state of New Mexico. So we're actually being much more thoughtful about how we build school calendars too. And so we've seen a kind of a new approach to, what that looks like from the very traditional, 180-day calendar so that we can really be much more supportive to the different areas of the state. This has been important because we have these wonderful conversations, not only with the school districts at the state level and with families, but also the other agencies within the state so that we can be supportive of each other to meet the families' needs across New Mexico.
Well, I know we are now at time, and I'm going to have to turn it back to Jarl, but I want to say thank you so much for all your vision, for all your leadership. It's so, I know we have a long road to go, but there's also clearly progress happening in both your states that can help to inspire all of us about across the country to keep doing more. Jarl, back to you.
Hetty, Secretary Romero, Commissioner Russell Tucker, thank you again for being so generous with your time and your experience, sharing what's going on and all the good work in Connecticut and New Mexico with our audience. We just have a couple of reminders and housekeeping to close out this webinar. First of all, I've dropped the link to the evaluation in the chat. If you could please just take a few minutes to fill out the form. Your feedback helps us make sure that we continuously improve the events that SEAC provides on our technical assistance activities. We also have a couple of upcoming learning series we want to make sure everybody knows about. You will receive an invitation to both of these through the registration for this webinar. And these will be announced also shortly by the Department of Education. But the first learning series focuses on promoting attendance early, tackling chronic absenteeism in early grades with a focus on kindergarten. So I would encourage you to take part in this 3-session event. And we also have a learning series focused on serving historically marginalized populations and how to address issues with attendance and chronic absenteeism. That will be starting in June. And again, you'll receive invitations for these series because you've registered for this webinar. If you want to contact the SEAC, if we could go to the last slide. What you see on the screen is the email to contact SEAC directly. So if you have any questions, any follow-up, please reach out to us and let us know. Again, you'll receive a recording of this webinar, all of the resources and the slides shortly after. And again, please don't hesitate to let us know if there's any way the SEAC can support your work. So thanks again once more for all of our panelists and for the great turnout we've had here today. And we hope that you have a great end to your school years and a great summer coming up. Thank you again, everyone. And thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.